we'll mix that up in a minute. So starting on the inside of the seating, Kelly Dent from she's the Global Program Director of External Affairs for the World Animal Protection Organization. So thank you, Kelly. Lourdes Inga, who, as you can see there, is the Executive Director of the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. Stephen Ripley, who's the Director of Investment Engagement and the Sustainable Investment Management company, and they are supporting the Responsible Commodity Facility. And last but not least, Peter van der Werf, who is the Head of Engagement and Executive Director at Robeco, which is one of the larger financial organizations with a particular focus on nature, biodiversity, and also the food system. So thank you very much. Before I give them a word in edgeways, I just wanted to run through a few points on the food system. And the food system is very large. It's supported by about 8.6 trillion US dollars of external private finance. That's equity finance and bank debt. But as you will all know, the food system is fundamentally destroying itself. The food system is eating its own natural capital base. It's a major source of GHG emissions. It's a major source of harm to nature. It's actually, ironically, a source of harm to humanity when really it should be giving life. It's actually bringing sort of harm and even death to a horrifyingly large number of people around the world. And it's incredibly wasteful. I don't think of any other industrial system in the world which actually wastes a third of its product before trying to get it to the people it's supposed to benefit. Now, we produced a report earlier this year looking at what financial institutions should be doing and can be doing to support the transformation of the food system. I'll talk in more detail about that a little bit later. But we think there's some very simple actions, at least conceptually simple, that would significantly reduce the climate footprint of the food system and also have a number of other benefits, particularly in terms of nature and health. Now, before we get into that, just very briefly, I think it's worth looking at the food system itself. We did a detailed analysis of the companies in the food system. We actually looked at 400,000 companies across the globe. That's ironically a very small proportion of the total number of companies in the system, or total number of businesses, probably more like 1 billion potentially, somewhere of that order, businesses around the world. And within that, what we thought was a large sample turned out to be rather small. Within that small sample, 4,000 companies, and that is 0.001% of the total estimated business population in the food system. Tiny, tiny proportion. They account for half the system value and a quarter of the aggregate revenues. So you can really get the sense of that curve, those really strong oligopolies in the system that are having a significant amount of control. Now, we broke the system up into segments, as you can see from that diagram. The disposal segment at the end, again, that's one where there's really very little information about the disposal of organic waste, most of which comes from the food system. And that, of course, is a major issue that needs to be dealt with. Just a couple of other points on the sort of the structure of the food system, narrowing it down just to look at the producers and the manufacturers and the retail and food service companies. You can see that half the revenues pretty much are captured by the manufacturing businesses in the system. But in terms of profits, it's half the profits going to the downstream end, the food retail and the food service companies. So again, distribution of sort of value and benefit through the system is disproportionately weighted to the downstream end. It's not being given to the producers at the upstream end. Slightly complicated heat map here, but what it's basically showing is if you take the analysis of company disclosures, or indeed the analysis produced by academics at a sort of top-down systems level, encouragingly, it actually does coincide. Companies are not disclosing nearly enough. The data coming out of companies is very poor. A lot of companies don't really disclose very much at all. But the ones that do, when you add it all up, you are getting a consistent picture. So the ones that are disclosing are probably giving you reasonable information. And you can see the harms are happening at the upstream end, at the producer end of the spectrum. And as we saw in the previous slide, the benefits, profits are going to the downstream. And if you look at the bottom line there, you can see the funding, and this is important, the private finance, bank and equity finance, again, is not going to the production end. It's going where the profits are being made. No surprise, because that's generally what investors are looking for. But where we really need the risk capital, where we really need the finance to be going, is upstream to help with the resilience and the adaptation and the transformation that's required. These were the themes that we suggested financial institutions should be focusing on, responsible supply chains, should be looking to increase true cost efficiency, true cost. There, notice that key phrase. We're not wanting 50-story pig farms rather than 25-story pig farms, because that's efficient in a financial perspective, but it's incredibly inefficient from a true cost planetary boundaries perspective. The system must reduce the amount of pollution. It's generating a huge amount of nitrogen runoff. It's generating plastic pollution. It's generating methane pollution. Those all need to be strongly cut back. And then finally, and importantly, people talk about sustainable consumption, tending to put the burden on you and me to choose. Our abilities to choose good diets and sort of food that's within planetary boundaries almost impossible in the face of the marketing spend of the large food companies. Because as you get to the supermarket checkout, they're whispering in your ear, another chocolate. And our Neanderthal sort of DNA cannot resist that temptation to buy lots of cheap, bad food, bad for us, bad for the planet. So what we need is we need financial institutions to focus on persuading food system companies to change the food environment. In terms of specific actions, again, financial institutions can pick all of these. We hope they do, but they could sort of pick from a menu, a smorgasbord. Stopping deforestation, obviously a complete no-brainer. Traceable supply chains, that's actually a really profitable investment. If you engage in if you get a traceable supply chain, you tend to cut down fraud and cut down waste and cut down loss. You're actually making more money. Cutting back on methane, also really important. To remind myself what else we had on the list, because I always forget. Mentioned food loss and waste. We need to halve that. Again, that's profitable. It's a hugely wasteful system. And then there are things to invest in, regenerative processes, whether that be agriculture or aquaculture. We have to have a system that actually regenerates its capital base. And the food system can do that. We can make money investing in that. And then finally, alternative proteins. And that could be sort of exciting, weird stuff grown in labs, but it could also be just eating more plants and less meat. So there are some very simple aspects to that as well. Okay, that's quite enough from me. I'd like to sort of hand over to the panel. So I'm just going to hand around some microphones and grab a chair for myself to sort of sit in the middle. Or no, I have to sit on the end, actually, I was told. So if our panelists want to sort of shuffle into the middle, and then we'll give some questions and hopefully have a chance for you to ask questions at the end. We'll see how we go. So just get set up with the electronic question sheet. So what I'm going to do is just ask our panelists to give a brief sort of introductory statement, explain a little bit about their view of the food system, what needs to be done, how their organisation is participating in that, and then we'll run around and discuss and have some questions. So Kelly, can I hand over to you first?
Thanks, Peter, and good morning, everybody. Congratulations on braving the maze to get in this morning. So I'm going to make a few comments on industrial animal production and, the damages that inflicts, and which then makes the case for why we need to see dietary shift, which is a point that Peter made as well. So worldwide, livestock production, it's not only a cause of great animal suffering, it's also a source of high emissions. And at World Animal Protection, for this COP, we've released a report which actually shows that factory farming contributes to 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that, that there's environmental impacts of industrial factory farming, but there's also the social impacts as well. And unless we tackle emissions from factory farms, which are part of food systems emissions, we're really going to have trouble to meet that temperature goal in the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees. We're also going to have trouble in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, biodiversity goals, etc. So it's the tackling of industrial factory farming within our food system is really crucial. And we know that the impacts of factory farming have been really documented. We know that they include excessive greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation to grow the feed for the factory farms, but which also displace uh, wild animals from the habitat when that land is razed, and then it affects freshwater use, pollution. Smallholder farmers are displaced from their lands, and I'll come back to smallholder farmers a bit later and the critical role that they play in food security and the real lack of support for them, and it's a really important part of looking at our alternatives. So these are some of the reasons why we really need, and I should also mention things like labour issue within industrial factory farming. We've got antimicrobial resistance and the spread of disease as well. Very high likelihood of the last pandemic originating within a market that sold live animals. It could very well have originated out of factory farming. Zoonotic disease is the transmission from any animal, and it's usually when they're kept in very cramped conditions. So this is, I guess, why one of the reasons why we need to see an urgent transformation of our food system and why we need to see it centre stage at COP. We need to address industrial livestock value chains, and we need to see development banks taking redirecting finances away from some of the large agribusiness companies that they have loaned to, such as Danomi, Campina, Smithfield, and many, many others. I'm just picking out a few there. Um, we need to see those financial flows redirected towards sustainable food systems. And I would also argue, as well as protein diversification, in particular, to small scale producers. Um, am I about out of time? Okay. Well, I shall. I I will stop and say more later.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Good to keep people coming back for more. So yeah, you were talking about sort of redirecting finance away from large-scale industrial agribusiness towards smaller scale, and I guess sort of typically Indigenous peoples are often thought to be at the smaller end of the scale. But maybe let's ask an expert whether that's really true and what should be done in terms of funding flows to Indigenous peoples. Can I hand over to Lourdes?
Good day, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. I'm Lourdes Singa. I'm Quechua descent from Peru, and I am the Executive Director of International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. We represent a network of 56 members, majority of which are foundations that are based around the world and funding Indigenous peoples worldwide. I think to your question, I was looking at your first slide or one of the slides where why we need to change that food system as it is right now. And I think you were having like all the impacts of industrial agriculture. And I think indigenous people's food systems is the opposite of that. It is sustainable. It doesn't harm soils. It doesn't harm fresh water, which I think we need to put as part of the equation when we're thinking about financing. We know that water is a key issue for everywhere. Also, indigenous peoples' food systems have given the rich biodiversity that each of us in this room enjoy and are also protecting the remaining biodiversity that exists in the world. In terms of financial flows and funding in general, either philanthropic or financial flows, a common thread across the board for indigenous peoples, regardless if they are based in the so-called global south, so-called global north, is access to finance, and access to funding. I think we need to rethink this by approaching some of the indigenous organizations that have set up self-determined funds to manage financial and funding flows to indigenous communities, indigenous organizations. They are such organizations in terms of impact, investing funds in Canada and the US and in Australia as well. But I know some of the interest is also in like the Amazon. And in terms of the Amazon, there is the Shandia platform, which is a political platform of 5 different forest-based indigenous organizations that have come together to mobilize both financial investment, but as well as philanthropic funding to their communities so that they can continue to practice indigenous food systems or sustainable agriculture as more commonly known, but doing it from a place of food sovereignty and not only food security. Food security is important, but critical is food sovereignty. And doing it from a place that is also going to continue and support the intergenerational transfer of knowledge, the inclusion of women, and livelihoods, which at the end of the day, I think this is some of the conversations that we're having. I know from the investor side of things, you all care about making money. For indigenous peoples, it's also about the well-being of their communities and enabling and creating livelihood to support the ways of living of indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Lourdes. And I think that that point about livelihoods is important to remember, because not only is the food system feeding us, but it's also, of course, supporting many, many jobs around the world. And in terms of sort of jobs, large companies obviously employ a lot of people, but they also have large relationship networks. I was looking the other day at Nestle, for example, claims to have a relationship with 600,000 farmers, 600,000 farmers worldwide. So for better or worse, these large companies are very, very important in terms of system change or resisting systems change. And the good news is that some of these large companies are actually moving in the right direction. And so I'd like to hand over to Stephen Ripley now, who represents the Responsible Commodities Forum. And Steve, can you tell us a bit more about what's actually going on there and how large food system companies are actually contributing to the change that's needed?
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. So my name's Stephen Ripley. I'm the Director of Investor Engagement for the Responsible Commodities Facility. I'm going to tell you a bit today about what the Responsible Commodities Facility is, how it operates, and also give you a bit of the history of how it came together, particularly referring to my previous job, which is working for Tesco as a global forest manager. So I think it's always useful to start with the why. Why are we doing this? Well, I think the why is a commonality for all of us here. We need to reduce emissions by 50% in 7 years. And that's a mind-boggling prospect, I think, for all of us. So I think it's very clear to everybody here that we need quick wins. We need quick solutions, and tackling deforestation, as Peter mentioned earlier, should be a priority. Why it should be a priority is because it could deliver a quarter of the emissions reductions required by 2030. So the Responsible Commodities Facility is a mechanism to deliver this reduction in deforestation, and particularly one that effectively delivers the reduction at zero cost. So before I get into how it does that exactly, I'm going to talk very briefly about where. And the where is the Cerrado in Brazil, which is an area which is often overlooked, which is strange because it's 50% of the size of the EU. It also contains 5% of the world's biodiversity, but unfortunately, unlike the Amazon, has relatively weak legal protection. So now, coming to the how, I'm sure you're all eager for me to get to the point of how the RCF protects forests. And essentially, we do this by offering financial incentives to farmers who own large properties in the Cerrado to maintain the forests on their farm, all of the forest, even over and above the legal minimum. And we ask them to sign contracts in return for low interest credit or business finance, which they need to operate their businesses. But if they want access to this low interest finance, they must sign a contract saying that they will maintain all of the forest and not convert any natural vegetation on their farm on an annual basis. So then you're probably thinking, okay, well, how does a supermarket get involved with that? It seems a long way from my regular shopping in Tesco. So once these loans have been made to the farmers, they're then securitized and listed on the Vienna Stock Exchange, and this is where our investors acquire um, the kind of green bond that we're offering. So the investors earn an annual rate of interest. They also get their full initial investment repaid at the end of 4 years. And that's what I was referring to in terms of kind of cost neutrality from the respect of the supermarkets. I should say the supermarkets which founded the Responsible Commodities Facility were, of course, Tesco, who I used to work for, and also Sainsbury's and Waitrose. They invested in our first round. Very recently, we closed the second round, and we now have the support of the big banks. So Rabobank, Santander, and a fund called Agri3 Fund have also invested, and the fund has therefore grown from 11 million to 47 million. But we need to go further. The Cerrado is very big, as I just pointed out, and we need more impact investors. We need more supermarkets. We need more manufacturers and food service companies to step up and say, I'm going to put my hand in my pocket. Initially, I know I'm going to get my money back, but I'm going to make this investment because my business depends on it. You know, these companies each have a massive soy footprint. Tesco has 600,000 tons per year dependency on soy. Some of the food service companies have a much larger soy footprint. So without the soy industry, and particularly without the high quality, high protein, low cost soy from Brazil, you know, they're out of business. So it's in everybody's interest to keep that soy flowing and make it sustainable. Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed, Stephen. That's really helpful. So to take it away from the sort of, if you like, that narrow, deep focus on the soy industry coming out of Brazil, throwing it over to Peter, who takes a sort of global asset manager's view. Peter, what can asset managers do to help drive the transformation? What's going on at Robeco, for example?
Thank you, Peter. So my name is Peter van der Werf. I'm head of engagement at Robeco, which is a global asset manager. We're based in the Netherlands, but with a global reach of pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, and others that we service with our investment strategies. We're one of the asset managers that really has taken sustainability and sustainable investing at the core of what we do, and this translates in our sustainable investing policy, where we have climate, biodiversity, and human rights as the core pillars of how we manage all of our investments. Just to give you a bit of a picture, those are then indeed investments in the large multinationals in listed equity or in their bonds or our government bonds portfolios. But that also gives us an avenue to actually speak with a lot of them. That's the reason that I'm here at COP28. And that's a program that we run with 18 people in my team, where we speak with over 250 companies, several governments every year, and a lot of other stakeholders around it. And with that work, we are really looking to accelerate the transition that these companies need to undertake. And I think Peter gave a very good overview of the transition that the food system needs to go through. And that's something that we have been working on for the past decade as well. In many cases, it is challenging for these companies. That's the feedback that we're getting, to make the transition at the speed that is required, given where their end customers are, given where the competitive level playing field is. And those are some of the topics that we really try to break through. So we've been involved with the Responsible Commodity Facility in helping to get that off the ground, really pushing the companies that we invest in to actually start supporting this, because it's one of the real underground solutions that we recognize in the soy supply chain. We've been very involved with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, again pushing companies to adopt certified palm oil, because for us that comes back to the commitment we made 2 years ago in Glasgow, where there is a Glasgow deforestation commitment for financial institutions to end deforestation in the for deforestation risk commodity supply chains by 25. So we've developed a deforestation policy, and a lot of the work that is discussed here also by the other panel members all feeds into there. So we've set up Nature Action 100, where indigenous rights is actually one of the really important elements where we see a connection between human rights and biodiversity, because a lot of indigenous groups are really the sort of stewards of much biodiversity habitats that are still available. And at the same time, our agenda is really to get these large multinationals to commit to change. And I think this is where ultimately, yeah, they really need to also get their end customers, the consumers, to move with them. Maybe one example to give of a recent success. Earlier on in the supply chain with the soy traders in Brazil, we've been pushing Archer Daniel Midlands, which is one of the US-based soy traders that is listed on the stock exchange, and therefore we can invest in, to commit to deforestation, and most recently to also include no conversion in the Cerrado, which is actually really important, because a lot of the savanna woodlands there also are under pressure, and they were not covered by their previous commitment. So this is one of the ways that we can really affect change. So we filed a shareholder resolution. We got all of the global shareholders to vote on this, and as part of the negotiation, Archer Daniel Midlands then made a commitment to do research, and if that was positive, to really incorporate this in their policy. So those are some of the steps that we can take, and it's with a lot of multi-stakeholder activities with all of us here on the panel that I think we need to get the food system to go into that much needed transformation to achieve the climate and the biodiversity goals that are so important.
Thanks very much indeed, Peter. Yeah, and great to really remind us about the biodiversity goals as well as the climate goals. I think one of the things encouraging about this COP is seeing nature much more on the agenda, with food very much as the sort of the nexus between the two. But we really need to see much more from a sort of nature and climate perspective. And on that point, Kelly, if I can turn back to you, dietary shift is mentioned as sort of a necessary change, and you sort of referred to that. Often equated with sort of everybody's got to go vegan, and then all of us who are not vegan sort of go, no, well, I'm not going to do that, and then the sort of debate seems to stop. But it's actually, well, much more nuanced than that, and actually potentially much less radical, isn't it? What do we really need to do in practice? Grab that microphone.
Okay, don't worry.
I'll keep hold of this microphone. It's mine now.
Fair enough. You're the moderator. Question. So, I mean, we absolutely. I think it's in terms of dietary shift. We're not saying everyone needs to go vegan. It's simple and it's nuanced and it's big. It's all of those things. But I think we can manage that. So we need to see a reduction in emissions from factory farming. We need to see no new factory farms. We need to see in the factory farms that do exist, we need to see high welfare animals already in those systems. We need to see finite flows to protein diversification. We need to see. We also need to see. What was my other point? Sorry, I've just forgotten it. Hang on, just give me 1 second. So yeah, oh, that's right. How could I forget? We need to make sure that we see finance flows to small scale producers. This is really important. We actually currently are seeing about 0.3% of finance flows going to small scale producers. Now, there's different studies, but that's one. It's a tiny amount compared to the vast amount of funding that's going into industrial agriculture. So it's people in the small scale producers across Africa and Asia that are the most vulnerable, that are actually the ones that are feeding their communities. We also need to see, protection of traditional diets as well. So, in answer to your question, I think animals do have small scale producers, they have all within food systems, but we need to shift role and we need to not see them as kind of these units of production, essentially. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that sort of unit of production focus is a terrible consequence of the sort of industrialization of the food system. And Lourdes, you mentioned the point earlier that indigenous peoples sort of inherently adopt a sustainable approach to life, if you like, an approach to food production. And building on Kelly's point there about investing in resilience as well, because of course smallholder farmers and indigenous peoples are often most at threat from the climate change coming from, to a great extent, the industrial sort of farming process. So going back to the sort of the funding point then, what should multinational companies and financial institutions be doing to support the work that you're involved in, if anything? Presumably they've got lots of money. They should be doing something.
Yeah, I want to also touch just on a follow-up. I think um, I think we also need to rethink. Yes, diet is important, and all the points that are being made are important. But I think we also, I don't know how much of the type of organizations that you represent think about narrative change on of the big food companies that are doing the industrial agriculture that push consumers to consume at a level that is not sustainable, and it counters everything that we're talking about. I think that I think it's a big, big, big issue. And I say this because I was at an environmental conference 4 years ago, and I was sitting at a table, and I think one of the side visits at that environmental conference was visiting a shipyard and looking at what was happening with the bycatch, right? And how great it was that there are actually a nonprofit that is rethinking how to address that bycatch. When in reality, we shouldn't be even doing or supporting bycatch, right? Because that means that we're overfishing more than nature can sustain. And when we talk about biodiversity, I think we need to think about not only forests, we need to think about mountain communities. I come from Peru. We given the world potato, quinoa, tomato, corn, all these things that you enjoy, right? So
Can I just say thank you for this?
yet, I think we also need to think about the different ecosystems and includes those that are communities that are thinking that are basing their livelihoods on fish as well, which are the Pacific islands as well. So I think we need to, yes, ensure that we're protecting the forest communities, but also broaden it, because food does not only come from forests. If you actually, like, you look at your plate and look at what's being served, it's potato, it's all these different things, right? Fish, you eat fish. If it's fresh water, you hope that you're not eating freshwater fish, that it's coming from rivers that have been toxic, either because of oil industry or from pesticides, right? So I think there's a whole array of things that need to happen. But I think going back to your question, and I'm taking the example of what I know, which is Peru. I don't know if you're familiar in the Cusco region, the southern part of Peru, there's something called the Potato Park, which is about 5 communities come together to support an ecosystem of mountains and grow a huge diversity of potatoes. And I visited this a few years back, and they have set it up and talk about livelihoods. They have set up different, and each community taking a responsibility for what and how and what they're doing. But one of the stops that I made was on products that they were making and having not access to finance. And I think this is where the question comes in, right? How do you make financing accessible? And I understand that some of these financial flows, and including in philanthropy, gets becomes an issue because you're all looking at putting large sums of money and something that it cannot always be absorbed by the same producers or farmers at the scale that you all want it to be happening. So I think there needs to be a rethink if you're really trying to support those that are actually providing your food every day. You really rethink how financial mechanisms and financial flows are happening, because it's not just about putting in thinking about food and commodity. It is something that comes from the land that we need to be thankful for, and that we need to appreciate farmers and the indigenous peoples, knowledge holders who are giving that. And I want to come back to water is a huge issue, and I don't know how you are all incorporating that in your what's it called, KPIs or return on investments, right? Because it's not just about supporting the product, but because you are supporting indigenous food systems, you're also ensuring waterways are going to be fresh for everyone. You are also ensuring that forests are going to be protected. You're also ensuring that the remaining 80% of the biodiversity is going to continue to exist for the benefit of all of us. And I don't know how you quantify that, but there is a huge miss in these conversations because we're only putting the value thinking on the investors when we should actually put in the value on actually the people that are actually enabling us to have food at our table, enabling us to be continuing to ensure there's climate resiliency, and that we're not losing biodiversity at the rate that we're losing it at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Lourdes. That's a really good sort of summary of some of the issues, I think. And Stephen, the Responsible Commodities Facility is investing in people. I don't know how much water is sort of part of that equation, but you mentioned the fact that the facility has expanded from 11 million to 47, I think it was, which is a pretty big increase. But that's a drop in the ocean, or a drop in the Cerrado. How do you continue to expand that? Are there ways of getting other people to replicate that in other sort of landscapes? 'Cause it's a good example of landscape-focused finance, isn't it, really, I think, which is a phrase that's come up on a number of occasions.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely. Well, we've kind of created the example, and I think it is a good example of how kind of in this case private investment, but private investment that was offered at a kind of concessional rate. So the supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, and Waitrose invested, but they said we don't want lots of money back. This isn't a money making initiative. We're not investors ourselves. We want the impact. We want the impact for sustainable soy. So that's what we gave them. That's why the RCF, the Responsible Commodities Facility, was designed. It was also designed with a mind to allow the formal financial sector, the banks like Rabobank and Santander, our recent investors, to be able to finance, because it's very challenging for these banks to invest or make a business case. You can imagine within the bank itself, the sustainability manager within the bank trying to make a business case for a high risk, low return investment. Well, it's probably not going to get very far in the bank. But for the supermarkets and for the other companies which are in the soy supply chain, it's absolutely critical that the soy continues to flow from Brazil and that it's not restricted by regulations, which I'm sure you've heard of at the moment, such as the EU deforestation regulation, which is coming into force at the end of next year, the Forest Act in the US, and similar in the UK. So you can see that the kind of net is tightening, and that's potentially damaging for the supermarkets, the manufacturers, all of the companies in the supply chain who depend on the continued flow and the unencumbered flow of these globally traded commodities. So, in terms of what the financial institutions can do in order to help themselves, I guess, in many ways, is really to help facilitate the supply of sustainable soy. And in the case of soy, it's not smallholders. It's not a smallholder centric initiative. It is large, relatively rich farmers in the large part producing the soy. However, at the moment, they don't have any incentive or any business model to justify why they're keeping an extra 100,000 hectares of forest on their farm. They could cut it down perfectly legally. They would suffer no consequences. But many of them are doing it voluntarily at the moment, and these are some of the ones who are engaging and saying, "Look, we're going to make business sense for you as a business." And they are businesses, they are businessmen and women, and they say, "Okay, you offer me a reason to keep this forest standing." So that's what we're doing. And I think, as I said before, really for those companies that are absolutely integral in the soy supply chain and absolutely depend on the soy supply chain continuing to function and not be blocked by this kind of legislation. The other obvious impact of such legislation is a vastly increased cost of the commodity. If all the supply chains have to become segregated, you can imagine traders sending boats over from Brazil that are half full. Well, what's that going to do to the cost of the commodity? So Tesco's soy bill for 600,000 tons of soy a year, which it depends on to function as a business. What's that going to do to the bill for those 600,000 tons of soy, unless we support the suppliers to become sustainable? I'd just like to finish on one of my favorite statements by Paul Polman, and it was referred to in the previous presentation. He said, "Look, these kind of incremental CEOs really annoy me. They say, I'm improving. I'm really improving because last year I killed 3 people. This year I only killed 1. The incrementalism is not enough anymore. We have to go beyond that. It has to be transformative. And I think, responsible commodities facility and initiatives like it, anybody else can copy it, can take our model and copy it, are part of the solution. So the end of the supply chain companies, the manufacturers, the retailers, supporting the supply base.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That's a great sort of call to action to large companies to be transformative rather than incremental. And Peter, without sounding too much like a sort of sycophant, but Robeco has done a really good job in putting itself at the forefront of the sort of climate nature debate, not just the debate, but actually in terms of allocating capital. What are the lessons that you think other financial institutions could learn from you? Because you're probably quite far in front of the majority of the pack, I think might be fair to say.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So also thinking back on the comments that Lourdes made in terms of where sort of the real issue sits, and also what investors then can take as a blueprint, is that we ultimately need to go back with the companies that we invest in, because they are ultimately the ones that are making the decisions in the supply chains and where are they sourcing the food products, the ingredients, the commodities that ultimately they transform into a large array of products that they're selling to the market, is really to move back to that circular regenerative agriculture model, because that's where indeed the producer is central, where the circle closes, as you will. Instead of having commodities shipped from Brazil into Europe, where we're producing a large array of very cheap food products, and we ultimately then have the issues with nitrogen and with other types of biodiversity impacts in our countries. And at the same time, you see this globally, where the global supply chains just don't close anymore. So it's a very economically optimized linear model, but it doesn't pay respect to the smallholders and to those systems also from an environmental perspective. So I think this should be at the core of what food producers take as their blueprint for how they want to operate. Now, the challenging bit is this does mean that you're incurring more costs, that you're investing ultimately, and you're then up against competitors that aren't taking those decisions. I think that's the main challenge that we hear from companies, and that is on a CEO's mind when we speak with him, who might say, yes, I see this, I see all of the evidence, but I have also basically the sort of economic logic of the market that I need to adhere to, because that's ultimately where a CEO is also then held accountable to. What is the bottom line at the end of the year? And I think this is where this transformative shift needs to happen in convincing the CEOs like Paul Polman and others in making those commitments, but then also do this on a industry-wide approach, that all of them take a similar commitment and they're all in the same boat. Because as soon as half of them is in a boat that takes a different course and the others are still playing the linear game and offer all of their products as cheap as possible, then the ones in the first boat are missing out, and they will be fired in the end as a CEO. So I think this is something that is really crucial that we work toward. And that's why I think the policy shift is so important that we're discussing here at COP, where we're bringing biodiversity and food system for the first time into the really at the top of mind in the climate debate. And then I think there is a lot in the finance spectrum where access to finance ultimately needs to happen, which is on our end of the scale, which is really sort of large scale mainstream capital, all the way to the concessionary financing, to indeed financing projects. And they also have a large assignment to connect the different pieces of finance together to make that work. So that's something that we take to heart as a mainstream investor. Where possible, we're trying to also get others on board, as we've done with Nature Action 100, where we're bringing now more than 200 investors together with one single agenda to the 100 most systemically important large multinationals to start really making these commitments and start working on that transformation. And I sincerely hope that they will hear our call to action, and with that we can also start bringing this transformation to regenerative agriculture to life. Because a lot of the questions that the panel raised here will have an answer in achieving that model.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, and that Nature Action 100 initiative, I think, is really important. Planet Track is one of the organizations helping to support that. And I think the challenge for the climate community is that at the moment, nature is often regarded as a cheap solution. I think that's a mistake to think nature is our humanity's life support system, and climate is the problem that we're causing for nature. So I think there's a significant mental shift that needs to take place, and the food system is a great place to really see that play out and to actually sort of exercise that different view. What I'd like to do now just is to throw one last question to the panel, which is a simple one, and they've only got a few moments to answer it. But the sort of, what is the one thing you would change in 2024 about the food system or about how it is financed? What would that change be, and why? But if I can go to Lourdes first, because I also wanted to ask you, Lourdes, as well. I can ask you two questions to answer very briefly, but just to come back to Indigenous peoples. What is it that the food system and global food system, these agribusinesses, these enormous companies, these great big financial institutions, what can they learn from Indigenous peoples? Because often the two things are regarded as totally separate and completely alien one from the other. So what can which system learn from Indigenous peoples, And if there was one thing you could change in 2024, what would it be?
I think sustainability, um, care for life. I think that's critical. And respect for all living beings. I think we need to stop seeing food as just what you get off the shelf from the markets, or what you're eating here, buying. You really need to think about where that's coming from. And you need to think about that actually that farmer or that indigenous person put the love and care. You need to think about that indigenous peoples are fighting for their territories, and they're being pushed out of their territories, um, in the name of agribusiness. Um, and so, if you are supporting um, food producers that are not indigenous peoples, you better make sure that they are respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and their territories. And the consequence of your investment is not going to be the displacement of indigenous communities. Your second question was,
Would you change in 2024?
what would I change? As I was getting to come to this panel, we've been following the Indigenous Caucus, so we've been part of the Indigenous Caucus, and I asked the lead of the agriculture working group what would be like the message. And the message for Indigenous peoples is they want to be at the table. I think when there are all these different investments or financial flows happening, please invite Indigenous peoples at the table, because your ideas are not going to be 100% the best idea if you're not having an indigenous person as part of those conversations. They want to be at the table on policies. They want to be at tables on decisions that are being made on their territories. They want to be on the table and decisions that are making that are happening around financial flows, where others are talking on behalf of indigenous peoples. I think ultimately from the movement it says there's no conversations about indigenous peoples without indigenous peoples at the table.
Do you want me to go? Yeah. So the food system that we currently have isn't feeding the world, and it's actually making us sicker, and it's causing suffering for animals, for people, and for the planet. So what we've seen at this COP is a real starting to focus on food systems. We need to take food systems and the issues surrounding food systems, we need to take it out into the streets so that we can put pressure on governments to build the political will to change the food system and make it more sustainable. So I guess what I would like to see is a real effort to make the food system sustainable by everyone here and outside. And we need to do that. We need to pressure governments to change. We also know that the private sector will probably move faster than many governments. So it's really important that we put that pressure on. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Peter.
Yeah, thanks. When I think about 2024, I think it's really a critical year to make much more progress on halting deforestation. We have our commitment, but like a lot of other investors, to follow suit. We're speaking with the Consumer Goods Forum, which brings a lot of the companies together that ultimately are putting food on the market as a food producer. They have a forest positive coalition that has been working on deforestation commitments for from over a decade now. And those efforts need to come together. So from investors, from food producers, because that's where sort of we're at the end of the supply chain, as you will, and that signal needs to trickle all the way up to where smallholders are producing it, that we end deforestation and that there is a fair price that is paid again for food as a result of that, because we actually then find a model of really transforming the food system. So I think that's really if we're speaking a year from now, But I hope that we have a lot of commitments all coming together to make that happen.
Thank you. Let's hope so. Stephen, the last word.
Yeah, maybe I'll get a bit more specific, and it's a nice segue from the Consumer Goods Forum and the Forest Positive Coalition, in which I used to chair one of the working groups on soy. But I think for me, my wish is that the supply chain actually engage to implement the regulations. I'm particularly thinking of the EU deforestation regulation, which has been called the most dramatic and the toughest supply chain regulation that's ever been drafted. So it's got huge potential to transform commodity supply chains, but it's only words on paper. And the worst case scenario is that it creates segregated supply chains. All the good commodities flow to Europe. Nothing happens on deforestation. In fact, deforestation accelerates because it no longer has the positive force of the responsible consumers putting pressure on those companies to reduce deforestation. So again, going back to my point, if we can get the end users of commodities, both palm oil, soy, other commodities in the deforestation regulation, cocoa, coffee, etc., to really invest in the base of the supply chain and invest in engaging on those solutions for traceability and sustainable production, then I think we've really got a chance.
Thanks, Stephen. That's a optimistic note to end on. Too much in our discussion for me to really summarize, but I'm an optimist. I think the food system is a really exciting place to focus on, to look for our solutions. I think we can transform it. We need to, and we will, and it will really bring great benefits, and humanity will thrive as a result. And I hope that you've seen from this panel and also from the people in the room, there's a lot of expertise focused on this. The task is urgent, but it's very achievable. And if we'll put our shoulders to the wheel, we really can make a big difference. Thank you very much indeed for all coming. Thank you very much indeed to my panel for navigating their way around the blue zone. It's just a big thank you from me to you. And that's the end of it. If you want to ask questions, please do feel free to hang around. But we'll bring it to a close now. Thanks very much.
Right. It's not too much. No.